California, Berkeley in 2010. Her dissertation titled, quote, Representations of Race, Entanglements of Power, Whiteness, Garveyism, and Redemptive Geographies in Costa Rica, 1921 to 1950, explores the making and contestation of racial identity and West Indian belonging in the white-identified Central American nation of Costa Rica. She's currently a social science in practice postdoctoral fellow, as well as a visiting assistant professor in Afro-American Studies and History. Asia Leeds teaches courses on Black nationalism and internationalism before 1950, as well as the politics of womanhood in the African diaspora. So, please join me in welcoming Professor Asia Leeds, who is going to speak today to us on, quote, toward the higher type of womanhood, and that phrase is in quote, the higher type of womanhood, the gendered contours of Garveyism and the mapping of redemptive diaspora in Costa Rica, 1929 to 1949. Please welcome Professor Asia Leeds.
Thank you for my introduction, Professor Hill. Your work on the Garvey papers has been influential for those of us doing work on Garveyism, so thank you. I'm pleased to be here. I'd like to note that I use the term West Indians to refer to English-speaking immigrants of African descent in the British West Indies, primarily from Jamaica, and their offspring in Costa Rica. Although by the period in question, a significant portion of West Indians were born in Costa Rica, they by and large were not citizens of the nation. So I refer to both those born in Costa Rica and those who migrated to Costa Rica as West Indians. And West Indians came to Costa Rica as migrant labor on railroad and port construction projects since the 1870s. This migration increased with the development of the United Fruit Company and its banana plantations at the turn of the 20th century, and peaked in 1910 with the boom in bananas, just to give us a sense of what this migration looked like. And this brought about 20,000 West Indians to Costa Rica at the peak of this migration stream. But by the 1920s, the population declined, and the banana business suffered in the midst of plant disease and economic depression. So just so that we have an idea of what's going on in this space. So the title, toward the, quote, higher type of womanhood, the gender contours of Garveyism and the mapping of redemptive diaspora in Costa Rica. I altered the date a little bit. I'm going to speak from the time from 1922 to 1940. In 1931, Charles McLeod wrote into the Le Monde Searchlight, a West Indian weekly newspaper in Costa Rica, accusing his wife Louise of leaving, quote, his home and protection to carry on with other men, unquote. Publicly declaring the, quote, misconduct, unquote, of Louise, Charles's letter reveals the centrality of the newspaper in setting the record straight, calling out others, and defending one's own respectability. Louise, however, was not a passive victim of her husband's defamation. She voiced a counter-narrative, submitting her own letter to the Searchlight, which the editor printed the following week. Contesting the statements of Charles, Louise claimed that she was forced out of their home by the, quote, blows and ill treatment, unquote, she received, and her position as a, quote, slave and beating post, unquote, of the household. Claiming that she was the rightful owner of the McLeod home since her money was used to purchase it, Louise had faith that the, quote, laws of Costa Rica will not allow for her and her children to be turned onto the streets, unquote. The two letters reveal a number of interrelated issues that this presentation interrogates. First, the story of Louise and Charles McLeod illustrates the diasporic space to which West Indians and Limon belonged. In his letter, Charles details the couple's movements in the circum-Caribbean area. Marrying in Costa Rica in 1910, Louise and Charles then moved back to Jamaica, where Charles left his wife behind for seasonal work in Cuba, where he was likely a wage worker on the plantations of U.S. sugar corporations. The couple ultimately returned to Costa Rica at the request of Louise's mother and bought property in Siquieres, Limon. The case of the McLeods provides insight on the complexities of place and belonging among West Indians in Costa Rica. While Charles referred to Jamaica as quote-unquote home, the couple was shaped by what Laura Putnam refers to as the Western Caribbean migratory system. And here this map shows, highlights how close in this space, so how close the British West Indies and Central America were, and so it highlights the space in which West Indians moved from the West Indies to places like Cuba for sugar work, and in Central America to work on banana plantations and also in the building of the Panama Canal. So with her savings and his earnings from plantation labor in Cuba, and perhaps in Panama and other sites, as I mentioned, sparked by U.S. companies, Charles and Louise moved from wage laborers to small landholders, as many West Indians in Limon had done by 1921. Having settled in Costa Rica, along with other West Indians who remained in the Central American nation in the late 1920s and the 1930s, after the banana boom and in an atmosphere of economic decline and depression, Louise desired the rights of Costa Rican citizenship and the protections of Costa Rican law. Gender and sexuality also play a central role in the standoff between Louise and Charles. Leaving the, quote, protection, unquote, of the home, Charles characterizes Louise as no better than a commercial sex worker, charging her with carrying on illicit sexual relationships with men, in plural. Charles challenges her respectability, a highly treasured status among West Indians, especially women in Limon. Louise at once maintains her own respectability and redefines it for herself. While she was no longer a domesticated wife, she was, in her words, a, quote, working woman, unquote, who sold goods on the railroad and who found dignity in being able to support herself and their children. The women were both the objects of West Indian anxiety around respectable womanhood and female sexuality, but also, as I'll show in this talk, the authors of their own respectable subjectivities. The experiences and conflict between Louise and Charles is telling of the dynamics of the West Indian population in Limon during this time. Situated somewhere between British Caribbean and Costa Rican identification, West Indians increasingly articulated Afro-Costa Rican identities as power and governance shifted in Limon. As the United Fruit Company withdrew from Limon and the Costa Rican government began to nationalize the region, the West Indian community voiced their desires for permanence and citizenship in Costa Rica. And this was shaped in large part by Marcus Garvey's Pan-African organization, the Universal Negro Improvement Association, or UNIA. As the central organizing factor in the West Indian community, with 23 branches spread over the province of Limon, the McLeods, as upwardly mobile, land-owning, and educated West Indians, likely participated in the UNIA. The discourses of Garveyism could have informed the ways that both Louise and Charles defined female respectability, even though their ideas are seemingly divergent. The McLeod case also shows the significance of the newspaper in contesting negative representations and as a space in which women defined their own roles within the project of redemption. West Indians drew from multiple spaces of belonging, local, national, transnational, to make identity claims. And so here what I want to do is highlight the role of newspapers in the negotiation of nation and diaspora, and in shaping the gendered contours of Garveyism. There were 2 Limon-based newspapers published during this time. The Limon Searchlight, a West Indian weekly in Limon with a Garveyite editor, who was also a former UNIA branch president. And there was also the Voz del Atlántico, or Atlantic Voice, which featured West Indian columnists in the English language section. And West Indians in Limon also subscribe to the Harlem, New York-based Negro World newspaper, the main organ of the UNIA. Black women are unfortunately on the, quote, periphery of most historical documents, unquote, as Eula Taylor writes. In fact, their representations in the archives, according to Taylor, is, quote, limited, heavily tainted, or virtually non-existent, unquote, which explains the need for scholarship that engages what she calls the inner lives of Black women. West Indian newspapers, however, offer significant insight on Black women's participation in the UNIA, and borrowing from scholar Sean Michelle Smith, I read these local and transnational West Indian newspapers as a counter-archive, and one that was shaped by men and women, as we can see in the case of the McLeods. The cover of the UNIA membership card in Limon in the early 1920s outlined the efforts of the organization as, quote, striving for the freedom, manhood, and nationalism of the Negro, to hand down to posterity a flag of empire, unquote. For Garvey, the fact that, quote, a race without authority and power is a race without respect, unquote, led him to advocate as a fundamental tenet of the movement, the creation of an African empire. And even the sort of notions of liberation in this proposed African empire were gendered, and settlements in Liberia were characterized by Garvey as a place where blacks could, quote, enjoy the pure atmosphere of manly freedom, unquote. And Garvey did a lot of writing on that we can look at and think about as thinking of the quest of manhood of the race. And he used manhood specifically as a term often, as did other people thinking about sort of what race work was at this time. So equating power with manhood, the strength of a redeeming diaspora would enable blacks to, quote in his words, measure up in this world of men. The UNIA perceived its struggle against marginalization and powerlessness as a struggle against the feminization of the race. And so the making of a Black nation and empire was, like I was saying, this affirmation of Black manhood. So Garveyism offered sort of a competing narrative that satisfied these longings for manhood and also womanhood and quote-unquote normative Black families in the face of discourses of Black deviance. As Barbara Baer notes in her influential work on gender and the Garvey movement, some women accepted the gender roles implicit in Garveyism, but others rebelled against them, quote, creating modified positions of authority for themselves and reconstructing the prevailing views of womanhood and manhood in the process, unquote. And again, Eula Taylor's work on Amy Jakes Garvey, who's the second wife of Garvey, and who was associate editor of the Negro World newspaper from 1924 to 1927, I think gives us insight on how sort of redemptive womanhood was shaped through the newspaper circulation. Jakes Garvey introduced the Our Women and What They Think page to the Negro World newspaper. And in contrast to women's pages and in other newspapers, both Black and white, this page, in this page, Jakes Garvey kind of critiqued this idea that women should only be concerned with etiquette and fashion and sort of household tips. She frowned upon these frivolous discussions, actually. And so I look at Eula Taylor's work and thinking about how Jakes Garvey identified sharing ideas and writing as theorizing and a form of activism. An examination of the ways that UNIA women defined redemptive womanhood highlights then these dynamics between the local and transnational Garveyite community in defining what redemption was. Jakes Garvey was at the forefront, as I mentioned, and sort of crafted a redemptive womanhood at the intersections of feminism and patriarchy. And Eula Taylor uses the idea of community feminism, sort of negotiating between feminism and patriarchy. As the editor of the Our Women What They Think page, Jakes Garvey shaped the tone, language, and topics that circulated throughout the transnational community. And she helped to define a new Negro woman whose place was not limited to the home and who had a central role in Black uplift. And she tried to have the readership understand how the familial and public spheres were complementary and not opposed, and that women should have a central role in sort of the uplift of the race. And these are some of the articles that women in Limon are reading, because, like I said, the Negro world is circulating at this time, in addition to them writing their own articles in the Searchlight, which I'll get to in a second. An article in the Our Women section listed, quote, alternative rules for the housewife, unquote. And just sort of critiquing the idea that women should be sole cleaners of the house. One writer begs to know, quote, should only one person be expected to hang up the towels, wash out the basin, and clean the ring off the tub, unquote. So racial improvement required producing, quote, the higher type of womanhood, unquote, one that countered dominant representations of women, and Black women in particular, and challenged hegemonic constructions of both race and gender. Through the Negro world and participation in the UNIA, women in varying sites of this transnational community dictated the terms of what a Jamaican woman contributed to the section called, quote, emancipated womanhood, unquote. The newspaper, as a counter-archive, then enabled West Indians to produce their own self-representations against some of these dominant claims of Black deviance and inferiority. And Black deviance and the dominant logic that circulated in the Americas, and also particularly in Costa Rica, was rooted in particular representations of Black sexuality and Black womanhood. For Costa Rican nationalists who believed in the superiority of whiteness and the goal of white purity in the nation, Black female sexual immorality was thought to be the basis of the degeneracy of Blacks in general. A 1933 letter to Congress signed by 500 Costa Rican workers in Limon petitioned against the continued residence and employment of West Indians within the country since, quote, it is not possible to get along with the Blacks because their bad morals don't permit it. For them, the family does not exist, nor does female honor, and for this reason they live in an overcrowding and promiscuity that is dangerous for our homes, founded in accordance with the precepts of religion and the good morals of the Costa Ricans, unquote. So for petitioners, Black women were the primary cause of Black degeneracy, since the purported preponderance of promiscuity among West Indians was the result of the lack of normal home and familial relationships, so conceived as this women's sphere of influence, and this lack of what they call female honor. So both the Searchlight and the Negro world offered West Indian women alternative images of Black womanhood and femininity. And the newspaper also allowed West Indians to interact with the world, West Indians in Limon to interact with the world outside of the region. So in the aftermath of the Great War in Europe, and in a context in which news of lynchings and race riots in the United States and the occupation of Haiti circulated, West Indians were participating in this sort of diasporic space. They were rethinking their relationship to Europe at the peak of the fascist regimes of Hitler, Mussolini, and Franco, and the Italian invasion of Ethiopia. And this resulted in new reflections on colonialism and sovereignty. And here's a cover of an issue of the Atlantic Voice with Selassie front and center. So this is the first cover of the newspaper, large picture of Selassie. So things in Ethiopia then are crucial to thinking about the Black diaspora, and also their implications to Black freedom locally in Limon. Enlisting particular imaginings of the African diaspora, West Indians sought to redeem Black identity from some of these from ideas of race and power that hindered their sovereignty. The making of redemptive geographies of race, therefore, was shaped in this transnational field, in which counter-representations of blackness were articulated through diaspora and the idea that shared identity and interests linked the black world. So the conditions of placelessness really shaped black identity for both West Indians in Limon and also in the Americas in general. And as Robert Carr argues, quote, alienation by and from states is constitutive of the shared history of black citizenship and of blackness as a socio-political category in the New World, unquote. So denied the rights of citizenship in Costa Rica, claiming belonging to a redemptive diaspora gave West Indians a means through which to prove their capacity for modern citizenship and self-governance. So here's Costa Rica, and I should have probably put this slide a little earlier, but Limon, and I don't have a pointer, is the Atlantic region of the country. So where it says Caribbean Sea, the province along there is the province of Limon. Whereas the official national identity of Costa Rica is a white one, based on a narrative of history that highlights the Spanish ancestry of Costa Ricans, Limon has historically been characterized by its racial difference and the existence of indigenous people and people of African descent since the colonial period. The state of the banana industry and the roots of migration and immigration to Limon inform the context in which racial identities were made and contested. So at this time period, in the 1920s, Costa Ricans from other parts of the nation, because Limon is really sort of underpopulated, and this is the reason why workers from the Caribbean were hired. So Costa Ricans are coming from other provinces, the Central Valley and other places into Limon for work on United Fruit Company plantations, and this is sort of changing the nature of what's going on in Limon. So through migration to Limon, Costa Rican workers are experiencing a new kind of racial hierarchy within the nation, because United Fruit actually holds West Indians as a middle level on the hierarchy, on the labor hierarchy. So they were, as English speakers, used to fill positions of timekeepers, foremen, and other mid-level positions on the plantation. And many also were small holders of land, working for themselves and producing bananas they sold to United Fruit. So for Costa Rican workers coming to Limon, there's a sense of being sort of displaced by United Fruit's racial hierarchy. And this is significant because at the same time, elite groups, civic groups, are thinking about how sort of United Fruit imperialism is blackening the nation. So at this time, in the 20s, what we see happening is this idea of anti-imperialism, but that has a sort of anti-black discourse embedded in it. So there's this interclass production of white national identity from both workers and also civic organizations. And here is an article that says, what do we want Costa Rica to be, black or white? Talking about sort of the black problem and the current banana contracts. So how bananas and United Fruit kind of brought this black problem to Costa Rica. And here are, by province, sort of racial statistics. And the point is to show, first of all, that Limon is very black. It's like 94% negro. But also that black people are sort of encroaching into other parts of the nation. So here the statistics show that, in the Central Valley, for instance, there are black people have sort of moved into the nation. And these civic organizations, opposed black integration based on the idea that blacks, quote, had a greater predisposition to sickness such as tuberculosis, leprosy, syphilis, and insanity. And just the general idea that blacks were deadly for the Costa Rican social order. So in this context of shifting sort of landscapes of power and the nationalization of limon, and at this time what's happening, especially in the late 1930s, is that United Fruit Company production is being transferred from limon, from the Atlantic coast, to the Pacific side of the country. And so this made the potential movement of West Indians outward from limon a national Negro problem, where previously it had been a regional nuisance. So there were laws at this time enacted to restrict black movement. In 1934, the new banana contract put in a caveat that blacks would not be allowed to be hired as workers. And there are other laws of explicit racial segregation that came out of this time period. So the politics of redemption and race consciousness of the Garvey movement informed both the intra-community struggles of West Indians, as well as the language and framework through which Limon Garveyites engaged with the Costa Rican government and society at large on behalf of the West Indian community. Garveyites in Limon believed that redemptive diaspora could be enacted through respectable behavior, including sexual morality, sanctioned familial relations, and public restraint. Although often characterized as the perpetrators of what they saw as sexual indecency, young West Indian women were also portrayed as the key to black success and integration within Costa Rican society. And the UNIA informed the making of a number of women's auxiliary clubs that specifically targeted young women and urged, here's a headline that appears very frequently, the type that appears very frequently in the Limon Searchlight, is anxiety around the behavior of women. So to counter this, there were these clubs developed that urged, intellectual encouragement as a solution to the quote-unquote crisis of black womanhood in Limon. Debates and weekly lectures and the like were aimed at stimulating the minds of West Indian women and therefore rerouting the seemingly innate bodily desires toward transgressive behavior. The Young Women's Social Club, for instance, sought to, quote, subdue the darker passions, unquote, and reclaim, quote, those whom I have erred, to stimulate the highest achievements possible in moral life, with the goal of commanding the respect of the community in which they lived. So, this is similar to what Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham does with respectability in the black Baptist women. So the idea that the behavior of black people sort of reflected on the race at large, and that behavior and respectability were linked in both of these cases. So then the making of redemptive blackness through the representation sought to showcase respectable young women as examples of the true nature of black women at large. So women who deviated from the model, this respectable model, had also deviated from what it meant to be authentically black in the minds of Garveyites. The exclusion of certain parts of the West Indian community and the heralding of specific types of women was part and parcel of this project of redemption. According to E. Patrick Johnson, blackness does not belong to any one group. Quote, rather, individuals or groups appropriate this complex and nuanced racial signifier in order to circumscribe its boundaries, unquote. And at this time, Garveyites were echoing the hypothesis that black sociologist E. Franklin Frazier had in 1939, this idea that bad black mothering was the root of black people's societal problems, and that there was this idea that black women's bodies and behavior had to be regulated in order for race relations to improve. Both in the Searchlight and in the Negro world, motherhood was redemptive motherhood was a topic that was written a lot about by women. For instance, in her message to the Negro women of the world, the lady president of the Philadelphia division in 1922 declared that, quote, the redemption of Africa depends on the motherhood of black women, unquote. So redemptive mothers were role models for redemptive culture, taught children to value and love their race and history, replaced white images with black ones in the home, and would therefore produce the redemptive children of the race who would lead their people on toward progress. And here's an advertisement in the Negro world for Negro dolls. And I think this is representative of this call for black mothers to kind of train their children to have race pride. In an article entitled "The Obligations of Motherhood" from the Negro world, black women were encouraged to, quote, spend evenings reading to their children about Frederick Douglass, Toussaint Louverture, and Phyllis Wheatley, so affirming the relationship between black achievement, motherhood, and diasporic citizenship. In Limon, a young West Indian woman named Philomela became a regular contributor to the Searchlight, writing a series of articles, Philomela's Serious Talk with Girls, a column series featured in the newspaper in 1930 and 1931. For Philomela, young women had a central role in the uplift of West Indians in Costa Rica, so sort of echoing what's going on, what ideas are circulating in this Garveyite community, this transnational community. And so she defined redemption within the social and political landscape of Limon. The development of the mind and intellect, in her opinion, was a means of resisting the purported inherent sexual desires of young women. So while affirming patriarchal control over women's sexuality on the one hand, Philomela also sought to empower West Indian women to take control over their own destinies. So the success and progress of black women would raise the standard of life in the province at large, in Philomela's view. Quote, better your situation for a better Limon, unquote, she instructed. So with the right aims, Philomela envisioned the UNIA and other clubs as being a part of this vanguard that would help to improve the position of West Indians in Costa Rican society and to make Limon, quote, better and cleaner by their good example. So redemptive womanhood in Limon was shaped by this desire for racial improvement and this belief of the central role of women to lead the race toward an equal position in Costa Rican society. So in conclusion, in my dissertation I show that Garveyite redemption was largely complementary to Costa Rican nationalism. So the ideas of, in the realm of gender and respectability, the ideals of racial purity, and the sort of truth of race, I showed that both sort of white nationalism and black Garveyite nationalism had certain logic, certain ideas in common. The logic of redemption, however, would motivate West Indians to fight for citizenship and equal rights in Costa Rica. And this was a challenge to dominant narratives and terrains of Costa Rican nationhood. And Garveyism really encouraged West Indians to participate, encouraged civic participation, informing the discourses upon which West Indians made claims to belonging in Limon. In the field of Caribbean intellectual history, women's theorizing, especially Pan-African theorizing, I believe is often left out of the discussion of West Indian thought in the interwar period. And perhaps closer analysis of black newspapers where black women, specifically the Garveyite newspapers where black women wrote a lot, maybe can help us think about how black women's theorizing shaped both the meanings of diaspora and sort of critiques of ideas of black womanhood. In black studies or African diaspora studies, Central America is a region I think that's understudied, but I think that it offers us a lot of insight on the stakes of racial citizenship and the bias towards whitening in Latin America. And in Latin American studies, this sort of category of ethnicity and ethnic difference, which is often used to talk about blacks and indigenous people, tends to obscure the centrality of race. So I think what's missing in Latin American studies is analysis of race and thinking about how race shapes these societies And I think this serves to reinforce the myth of racial democracy that hides the fact that whiteness and power go hand in hand in the region. Examining citizenship from the perspective of those at the margins of society gives us new insight on nationhood as well as the racial politics of belonging. In an environment shaped in the entanglements of U.S. empire and the exportation of bananas, legacies of plantation slavery, and anti-Black nationalism in Latin America, West Indian women and men constructed Redemptive, Diaspora, and Limon, Costa Rica, as a strategy of survival in the face of dehumanization. Today, Limon remains on the periphery of the Costa Rican nation. The representation of Limon as an other Costa Rica, or not quite Costa Rica, becomes a means to legitimize its underdevelopment and lack of national investment or concern. In Port Limon today, the UNIA's Liberty Hall still stands, and residents are quick to engage with a foreigner, me for instance, about Marcus Garvey, attesting to the continued significance of Garveyism to Afro-Costa Ricans in Limon. The diasporic practices, networks, and identities of older generations have become a part of the social landscape of Limon, which young people rework through dance hall and reggae music, and also through engaging with Rastafari, which holds Marcus Garvey as a prophet. So the diaspora, therefore, continues to shape the dynamics of Black identity making in Costa Rica. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. Very interesting. So we'd like to invite your comments or questions, observations.
Okay, well, I'm very
Little louder.
happy. I'm sorry. I'll speak up. I'm very happy to hear about your work, and I've been interested in the area since the 90s, since I stumbled upon Limon on a trip to Central America with some faculty members. What I would have been interested in, since I'm in communication, is actually studying the newspapers, the evolution of the newspapers, but you use the newspapers as a vehicle to get at the issues that you were interested in about, well, basically, the role of Black women. I have many questions, but the one that I guess bubbles to the top is, did the Garvey, or membership in the Garvey movement, push people to be more part of life in Costa Rica, this issue of citizenship and so on, because they wanted to improve their image, so to speak, with respect to the Costa Ricans? And related to that, then since, at least initially, when I read, the West Indians prided themselves on being British subjects. So, you know, the Garvey movement gave them a chance to find a new identity, in my mind. I'm not an expert on all of this. Do you have any reactions to those particular issues?
Yeah, during this time period, I think it's important to keep in mind that across the region, race-based exclusionary laws on immigration were taking shape. So in the U.S. after 1924, in Costa Rica, there were new laws against Black immigration, for instance. This is happening across the region. And like I mentioned, the West Indians who were in Limon at this time, so after the boom in bananas, had homes and property and sought to stay there. I mean, their options were closing around them in this area. So yes, I'm looking at how West Indians used the language and ideas of Garveyism to first sort of critique the dominant ideas of Blackness that were circulating in Costa Rica, and to use those to make claims to Black sort of belonging and citizenship in Costa Rica. And this was their goal, to get citizenship, to prove that the Black community was suitable for being a part of the nation. And a lot of the petitions written on behalf of the West Indian community sent to the Costa Rican government were Garveyites, people who were involved in the UNIA. I mean, these names I see in the newspaper, also in the petitions, also in relationship to the different UNIA branches. So, you know, I'm interested in thinking about how Garveyism is informing two things. Informing belonging to a larger African diaspora, but also informing how West Indians made claims to belonging in Costa Rica at a time period where the situation was very hostile. And then with British subjectivity, and this is too where I think sort of the formation of diaspora comes in, sort of belonging to diaspora, is that in events going on in the world, and specifically the Italian invasion of Ethiopia, which West Indians in Limon critiqued Britain for not giving Selassie a place of refuge. And for them, this sort of sparked reflections on the inherent racism of Britain's sort of strategies of dealing with what's going on in the world. So yeah, at this time, I mean, they're definitely thinking about or critiquing colonialism and what it means to be a part of an empire. And the making of an empire in Africa is sort of seen to some as breaking kind of these colonial chains and making a new nation, a new space of belonging.
Well, first of all, thank you so much. It was really interesting. And I wonder, because I don't know how easy it always is to tell authorship of the different articles in these papers, if they're always written or explicit, but I wonder, I get the impression that mainly it's women who are writing to and for other women, instructing them on sort of how to be better women, but I wonder if are there men writing articles as well, instructing women on what their role should be, or is it, so how's that authorship regarding women, how does that break down?
Yeah. In the Limon Searchlight, there were certainly a few articles written by men who had this instructive kind of sensibility. Because there wasn't a dedicated women's page in the Limon Searchlight, so I do see that there's less sort of compartmentalized. And certainly men were writing, thinking about, in this larger context of anxiety around women's behavior, men were definitely writing. In the Negro world, it seems that things were a little bit more compartmentalized, and I don't have a lot of examples, or I can't think of a lot of examples of men sort of speaking to what would be considered quote-unquote women's issues.
That was my understanding, yeah.
So that's a really good point to think about how the two archives sort of function differently in that respect. Yeah, but thanks for that question. It helped me think about the differences between the two newspapers. Yeah.
Any other questions or comments?
Hi, I really enjoyed your talk. I have a question about broadly thinking about Black women in this time period. So you talk a lot about how their sexuality is always up for discussion. And I'm wondering, why is that? Like,
Why was what? I'm sorry.
Why was female sexuality so much up for discussion? I find it striking, given I wonder if people are so concerned with Black female sexuality, not just in terms of like you said, creating this aberrant group of people, But I wonder if Black women were used at that time, like for sexual practice, or if people had particular actions tied to their attitudes towards Black women at the time. So if you could talk a little bit more about that,
The last part of your question, could you asked if Black men were being used for?
Well, I guess I'm trying to get at if people had attitudes towards Black women that led to them thinking of Black women as like easy, therefore it doesn't matter if we rape them, or Black women are promiscuous, so we can have sex with them on the side and have our concubinage was common all over Latin America, for example. I'm just wondering if this is a place where things like that happen.
That's an interesting question. Limon is an interesting space because it's, United Fruit has an enclave there, and things are kind of working differently there in contrast to the rest of the nation. But what the enclave does, I think, is it sort of keeps, maintains a sort of segregation between groups. Now, I'm sure people were having sex with each other in some ways, and I'm sure of that. But I think that there's something to the way that the enclave functioned, and that almost inhibited in some ways and on different levels the interaction between like Costa Rican workers, for instance, and the West Indians who were there in varying capacities with on the plantation in their varying positions of power. I think that in general, at this time, there are anxieties around female sexuality, so not just for Black women, because in the Costa Rican media that I look at, it's a similar anxiety around sort of the behavior of women, how this speaks to, or how this either inhibits or helps to progress the nation. I think this speaks a lot to the time period in general, in terms of the anxiety around female sexuality. And I mean, I don't know, I'm sure there were also these, because West Indian women did to some extent participate in commercial sex work. So I'm not sure how much that shaped the way that Costa Ricans looked at Limon, space of Limon, because there is, talk about prostitution, and this is sort of characteristic of what Black people do, what's going on there. I think that there's something at this time period that's a larger thing going on, whereby both Costa Ricans and West Indians are like invested in defining what womanhood is, because that it seems to shape the contours of racial belonging. So the stakes of making white womanhood, especially when there are these Black people who are trying to encroach in the nation, become so central. So, for instance, Costa Rican newspapers had this sort of visual campaign to circulate images of white women. And in the newspapers, there are frequent photographs of the sort of whitest women, and they're called women of honor, women of note. So I think, your question's good. I'm trying to, it brings up a lot of different things for me. So I'm thinking about how, if there are issues that are particular, thinking about Black female sexuality, or if I'm thinking about this in terms of what's going on at this time period with female sexuality in general. Yeah, so that's a good question. Thanks for your, I was thinking a lot about it in my head.
I'm going to kind of follow up on that a little bit. Now, if you don't want to pursue it, that's fine. But I guess my question on this whole issue is, what was the nature of the migration of the West Indians? Did it change over the generation? It started in the 1880s, and so on. So was it kind of the men migrated first and then called for the women? Maybe did it change from the first generation to the subsequent generations? And that may have had something to do with this, even though I think anxiety was there from what you're saying. If the women were not attached to the men, then obviously that raises a lot more questions than if there were family units there. So you have a sense of what the family makeup was, especially since the Costa Ricans were fond of attacking West Indians for not having intact families.
I think at this time period, those who are staying behind are West Indians who are staying behind in Costa Rica. and who seek permanence there are usually in some sort of family units. And I can't tell you the percentage of, man, woman, or et cetera, but there seems to be this sort of land-owning, home-owning family units at this time. And certainly you bring up a good point about the gendered situation of migration, because West Indian women were not directly hired by United Fruit, and they didn't work on the plantations at all. And so that does open up this space where women are kind of making their own economic opportunity. So part of this is, I think, opens up new anxieties about sex work. So this can maybe contribute to this anxiety around female sexuality, but also that a number of West Indian women were working as domestics. And this is what I'm working on for another article, but I'm thinking about how, and there's also anxiety around this sort of racial purity amongst Black people. So I'm thinking that there's a connection between the fact that many West Indian women were working as domestics in white homes, probably for the United Fruit Company bosses or others, and this, the idea that Black women had to be deterred from having interracial relationships with white men. So this is something that I'm working on and thinking about. But certainly the gendered contours of migration are important to keep in mind.
It was the same point. I was going to suggest maybe this issue of demographics could be important. It strikes me that the situation you're talking about is quite different from, for example, West Indian migration to Panama, like during the building of the canal, and which seemed much more sort of like single men going and working and then returning. But this seems different and possibly earlier.
Yeah, I mean this is
and more families, but still like because the gender imbalance could be cause of anxiety.
definitely. I mean I think too, and you bring up good ideas about the demographics. This time too, I mean the young men who can leave do leave at this time because there aren't jobs in Limon. So you're right to bring up this important, the importance of what's going on demographically here. It definitely shapes some of the stakes.
Okay, one more question. Okay.
Okay.
Going back to the newspapers, you talked about archives. A couple of things. One, were these archives in San Jose, to look at all the newspapers? And if not, where are there other places where one can go? And did you look at La Posta Atlantico to look for some of these? Because I think there was newspapers where the first generation of Costa Rican or West Indian migrants were served by this newspaper, and it was all in English. Next generation was bilingual, the third generation was all Spanish. So I'm just wondering if you, by the time that you're interviewing for your talk here, what are we looking at in terms of the range of newspaper outlets?
So yes, I do have to go to Costa Rica, to San Jose, for my archives. For the Limon Searchlight, and all the Limon papers are in San Jose. And the Negro World is Schomburg in New York. And thinking about this issue of bilingual writing, I think is really important. I cut off the talk in 1940, but if I had gone a little bit further to where my dissertation stops, 1949, which is the year that West Indians are officially granted citizenship. In the time period leading up to that, there is this shift in increasingly bilingual and then towards fully Spanish. So language becomes a way for West Indians, Spanish language becomes a way for West Indians to become Afro-Costa Rican. And the Atlantico is a really good example because you can see the shift from there being an English section, small, to there being articles pertaining to the West Indian community written in Spanish. So you can definitely see the shift that's taking place and this is why this time period is so interesting, like moving from West Indian to Afro-Costa Rican. Yeah, that's a good point to make.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Executive privilege, yeah.
Sure.
First of all, I think we should give Professor Leeds another big hand. I'd also like to thank Professor Robert Hill for coming and introducing, and offer him an opportunity to give a commercial, a plug on the Marcus Garvey papers that are here at UCLA.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. I give a plug, now that you've given me the opportunity, for a talk that we will be holding here in this room on March the 10th, Thursday, March the 10th.